We hear all these discussions. Should be Russian ambassador or Russian representative invited to Auschwitz? Meine Güte, there are other countries there, in Caucasus, in Asia, whose soldiers were there, who liberated Auschwitz as well as Russians. Why not to invite as a honorary guest or as a main speaker someone else? And it would be a good gesture. It would be really a good gesture. It's not like binary choice, Russia or no one.
Welcome to a new English language episode of Geschichte ist Gegenwart, the History and Politics podcast of Körber-Stiftung. We are dealing with the multiple ways in which the past matters for current affairs. I am Gabriele Woidelko and I will be your host for the next approximately 40 minutes. In 2025, Germany and Europe commemorate the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. And the question is how to commemorate the Day of Liberation while Russia continues to fight a full-scale war of aggression against Ukraine. How to deal with ceremonies and monuments honoring the allies of the Second World War and their contribution to the end of National Socialist terror in Europe. And how to counter the way Russia is using history as a propaganda weapon that legitimizes this ongoing war. This is what I've talked about with the writer, poet, journalist, and essayist Sergei Lebedew. Sergei was born in Moscow in 1981, and he has written 7 books, including 6 novels and a collection of short stories. His novels focus on Russia's past, particularly the Stalin era and its consequences for modern Russia. Sergei's books have been translated into 22 languages and have been shortlisted for a couple of important book awards. And among the writers and artists in exile, Sergei Lebedew is one of the most outspoken critics of Russia's misuse of the past under Vladimir Putin, and he is a tireless advocate for the voices of victims of Russia's colonial suppression. He has left Russia in 2018 and he currently lives in Germany. But without further ado, let's now tune in to the conversation. Dear Sergei, welcome to the History and Politics podcast of Körber-Stiftung.
Dear Gabriele, thank you for invitation. I'm glad to be here.
We are speaking to each other shortly after the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War.
In Europe.
In Europe, exactly. Thank you for adding that, in Europe. But before we come to the commemoration ceremonies and the parades that we've seen, and before we talk about the way Russia uses the legacy of the Second World War for its current war of aggression against Ukraine, I have a very simple question. When did the Second World War start for the Soviet Union?
When I was a Soviet kid, I was for 10 years. The answer would have been absolutely simple. June 22nd, 1941.
Okay, but now you are not a Soviet kid anymore.
And now I'm not a Soviet kid anymore, and I can say, it's September 1939, and this is the main point and the main problem for the Russian memory about the Second World War.
Could you explain a bit what exactly the problem is about?
The problem is very simple, that for approximately 22 months before the June 1941, Soviet Union and the Nazi Germany were faithful allies. And this is the moment which we, as Russians or the Soviets before, would like to forget. Because, of course, it opens the absolutely different perspective on results of the Second World War. When we know and when we understand that certain states were destroyed and absolutely occupied, totally occupied by the Soviet Union before the Nazi invasion, it's very difficult to describe what followed as the liberation of them. Mm-hmm. It's more of a reoccupation.
That's an interesting point, and we'll come back to the occupation part or to the reoccupation part later on, because that, of course, also matters for the current situation with Russia occupying basically bigger parts of Ukraine. But let's turn back to the, let's say, staging of the Second World War legacy in today's Russia. Let's have a look at 9th of May 2025 and what we have seen in Moscow. What is your observation of this year's parades on the Red Square?
I mean, first I think I would like to take us with the time machine a little bit back. As a Soviet kid, I was brought by my parents to see these military parades in Moscow on the day of October Revolution or the Victory Day. And the point of observation was very important, interesting, because we always were standing our bags to the American embassy. And of course, all these tanks, all these missile launchers, all these nuclear missiles were transported in front of American embassy. And being a kid, being like 7 years old, I still completely understood whom this message is addressed to.
Which means it was addressed to the US.
It was addressed to those who were there behind the curtains, probably looking at this. They were invisible, but tangibly present. And being a kid, I really felt proud, immense might, and display of this might, which I'm also a part of. And it really takes a person long time to understand that it's not a commemoration of victims. It's not a commemoration of those who had fallen. It's a display of the might. It's a political message. And exactly this was the point when these parades were reintroduced. I mean, we lived throughout the 90s barely without the parades.
When have they been reintroduced?
I think it's already the 2005, the 50th anniversary, and then they became more frequent, and then every year. Mm-hmm. And also, I had quite a bizarre memory of military parade on May 2014.
Yes, which was...
That
was after the annexation of Crimea.
It was already after the annexation of Crimea, already after the invasion in the east of Ukraine. I went there just to observe because I felt that it's a historical moment. Something is in the air. And two men of the military age were standing close to me, eating ice cream and discussing if they should draft as volunteers and go to Donbass to fight, because you are given basically a Kalashnikov thing with a lot of ammo, and then you can probably take this Kalashnikov back home and do some business.
Okay, that's an interesting one. That was 2014 when you were still living in Russia. You have left Russia in 2018, I think, and now you are living in Germany. So what is the difference between 2014 and 2025? Obviously, yes, you could not observe the parade yourself in Moscow, but I'm sure you have probably observed the screenings on TV and the news. So what would you say? What has changed?
I would say that it would be important not to observe the parade on Red Square itself, which is really made in a similar way every year. Maybe not even the list of the guests on the tribunes. But what happens on the periphery? How this parade is replicated in hundreds or probably thousands smaller parades in the provincial towns and cities. And it is there where you see the degree of absurd and the degree of military mobilization, because there it's all makeshift. It's not like the tanks are rolling. It's the children sitting in the tanks made of, packages, being drawn by their own parents And this is grotesque, of course, but there you can really observe the perversive meaning of this day, because you cannot commemorate anyone the way it is done in the periphery. It became really a makeshift amateurish display of the same power mobilization and hatred. But in the forms which betray its complete loss of meaning. It is just a display of old symbols which lost their any sort of significance except the sheer display of power.
Okay, that's interesting. If we look into the periphery, but let's move back to Moscow a bit, because we started our conversation when you told us the story about you being a Soviet kid and observing or feeling that it was not about commemoration at that time, but about display of might and power. This year at the parade, or in his speech during the parade, Putin has announced that every victim or everybody who has fallen as part of the Red Army is a Russian victim. So, I mean, he has kind of officially staged this narrative that the Red Army, which was a multi-ethnic army composed of many of people from many different nations or republics of the Soviet Union, that he has concentrated the victimhood on the Russians officially in his speech. So what does this tell us about the connection between the legacy or the staged commemoration of the Second World War and the ongoing Russian war of aggression in Ukraine?
First of all, I mean, this whole concept was introduced by Stalin, I think, in the first year, because it was he who said, I'm grateful to the Великий Русский народ, the great Russian nation, for its patience. So he singled out the Russians as a vehicle, as the benefactor, and as a victor. And now, of course, it took years Russia to monopolize the memory, to monetize this, let's say, moral capital. And I would say that's the only way for Putin's regime to sell the war, to sell the big war. Because, I don't know, 2 wars against Chechnya were easy to explain because it was about integrity of Russian Federation. But the invasion in the neighboring state, which is really linked by economical, family ties, cultural ties, it wouldn't have been easy to do without using what can be called like a propaganda nuclear weapon, meaning introducing the notion of fascism or Nazism and attributing it to Ukraine, which means you should ostracize Ukraine as much as possible, to make it as alien as possible, to explain and sell the war. In this case, of course, when we have a narrative of the Second World War being waged on the Soviet side by a multi-ethnic community, it doesn't work. And then you should say, I mean, Ukrainians were those who suffered, Ukrainians were those who forged the victory. No, it will not work this way. And the only mode which can work as a Russian propaganda tool now is it was only the Russians.
It was the Russians defeating National Socialism and liberating, in quotation marks, Europe from National Socialism together with the other allies.
Which allies?
Okay. So it's monopolizing.
No. I mean, you probably remember this book. It's like it's called, I think, Commissar Disappears, which shows how the Soviet propaganda censors the photos.
Oh, yes.
With some person being arrested, and then he's not in the photo anymore. I mean, then the very notion of allies, I mean, United States, Britain, France, and they underwent the same disappearance process.
Okay, it's
They in 2005, all prime ministers and presidents were present there. It was sort of a mutual thing.
You mean the commemoration,
Yeah.
the 9th of May on Red Square?
Yeah.
No? I remember these pictures. Yes.
And now, of course, they are they are not there. They are not in the narration, and vice versa. It's now not just a great patriotic war against the national socialism. It's quite frequently described as a great patriotic war against Europe.
Yes, against the West, against Europe. I mean, just as a quick remark, because you just said the European heads of state, they were obviously not attending the parade on the 9th on the Red Square on 9th of May, but one day before that they were, at least some of them were in Lviv and were invited by Ukrainian President Zelensky as to commemorate the victims of the Second World War on Ukrainian ground, and that was also very symbolic. But what you describe about monopolizing, or Russia monopolizing the memory and the commemoration of the Second World War, that creates a problem for Germany to a certain extent, because, well, when Germany celebrates the liberation from National Socialism each year on the 8th of May in the Bundestag and elsewhere, it has become more and more difficult, and we struggle with this memory, because Russia has been an aggressor now for more than 10 years, at least since 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. And how do you observe the way Germany is dealing with this challenge?
Maybe I'm not the best or the most enlightened observer, but I don't think that Germany is really dealing with this. Germany is stuck in a perfectly made trap.
Which means what?
Which means that what I would say that it's really difficult to discern between two things. The military defeat of the Nazi regime, which was achieved by military means and resulted in liberation from Nazis.
That's true,
yeah.
Yes.
This is the military story, and it should be described and told in the military terms. It's not about politics, it's about military. And the political story is absolutely different. But what was always the main Soviet thing is to tell, in this case, the military story is a political story. But the political story is different. Political story is the story of conquest and occupations.
Okay, you have to explain that a bit more.
I mean, it was not necessary for the military defeat of Nazis to occupy and subjugate all the nations which states or which lands the Red Army was passing on the way to Berlin. It's somehow, I mean, history justifies itself, and we see the way it happened. But no military means requested this. No military goals requested this. And in no way this goal can explain why then for 50 years so many nations, some of them like Poland, were fighting Germany from the very first day, ended up in occupation regime. I mean, we can discuss what sort of occupation and so on, but in unfreedom, in injustice, in imposed from above light or heavy political dictatorships. And these two things are not corresponding. And of course, for Germany, I would say it would be really difficult and painstaking to... you cannot reverse this. You cannot say it was not a liberation. It was. It was. Nazis were gone, and luckily forever.
No, well, we are discussing about this at the moment in Germany, but yes, historically speaking,
historically speaking, yes. But then the next story starts. The story of Eastern Germany. The story of Eastern Germany was honestly, by no means, is justified by the goal, the military goal to defeat the Nazis. You cannot justify one thing by other.
That's interesting, because what you are referring to is obviously the post-Second World War order or security order in Europe, where we see a kind of Cold War arrangement that separates Europe into so-called spheres of interest, and the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union on the one side, and then the West and on the other side.
I would say honestly that maybe it's not the role of Germany to start and push this conversation. Germany maybe could wait, but Poland, Baltic states, they could be leading here.
But don't you think that, at least from my point of view, from my observation, Germany has been waiting? You have said Germany is stuck. Germany has been waiting for many, many years, did not start this conversation. But if I look to, let's say, the Baltic states and Poland, but explicitly the Baltic states that very early came up with this plea to commemorate the Soviet occupation of their countries in an adequate way. I mean, they have been talking about this for years, at least for 15 years, if not more. And the question is, you said Germany can wait, but wouldn't it be appropriate for Germany now to come to terms with that and to listen to these stories and to integrate these stories into our own conversation even more?
I would say that it's not just for Germany, it's for the general west of Europe. Because Germany, at least a part of Germany, knows very well what it was. Maybe we cannot really formulate this now or express, but at least some people know and remember. But then, further to the east and south, starts the zone where these voices are not really present. And I would say that the whole thing would be more of offering some transnational and continental narration which unites everyone in Europe. Because this is the gap or the rift or a rupture between those who experienced and those who had not. And of course the Baltic states were ridiculed for many years. And you're just small nations who don't feel secure, you're overreacting. But the thing is that, I would say that should be a sort of concert action. Maybe someone like Germany provides means and, tools, while the other voices are given more space and role. But when just one country speaks, when it's just a museum in Vilnius, it doesn't work. It should work. It should be a sort of a joint narrative, sort of a shared experience. I cannot refrain from referring to Anne Applebaum's Iron Curtain. This is the best, I would say, example how the story could and should be told. But this is just only the book. We should have a museum of Iron Curtain.
Or at least a broader narrative and understanding. I would like to ask you, because, what is, or where do you see the role of Russian actors in this? This shared commemoration, retelling the story of the Iron Curtain. What are the Russian actors who should be involved in this? Is it all the exiled intellectuals? Is it writers? Is it historians? Because obviously inside Russia at the moment it's very challenging, if not impossible, to speak freely about this, to speak freely about the war. So who can play a role?
I mean, geographically, we have sort of a theoretically good start, because a lot of people who are in exile are living exactly in the countries we are talking about. It's Poland, it's Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia. They are there already. Mm-hmm. And I know and I feel that there is still quite a uncomfortable and bad understanding from their side. Why actually they are so suspicious? Mm-hmm. Why are they treating us with such a demand? But at the same time, it's a moment when you can really start learning if the broader narration is offered. Because we failed not just to recognize the Soviet crimes within the Soviet Union. It was theoretically and legally they were recognized. And in the beginning of the 90s, some laws were passed. We have juridical definitions. Even Mr. Putin sometimes, when he have a good spirit, refers to the 1937...
To Stalinist crimes.
Stalinist crimes. He says, we cannot repeat this. Mm-hmm. And so on. These are... It's not the narration... This narration still stands, even in war circumstances. But the external aggression, the external crimes, the external occupation is just lost, forgotten, and it's not in the mental map. I think Levada made a...
Levada, which is the polling institute, yes.
Made an inquiry before the full-scale invasion, or maybe even before the annexation of Crimea. They simply asked by a broader audience, do you think that the Soviet presence, Soviet occupation of the 3 Baltic states was really an occupation? And the answer, yes, was 2 or 3%.
2 or 3%? Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's a very telling thing. It's a very telling thing. And this result tells us that politically the whole neighborhood is in danger. The whole neighborhood is in danger, because it means that people do not have on their mental map that this was a crime. And they still support, subconsciously or not, an idea that this was somehow justified. And if it was justified before, it would be justified once again.
So that means you would say that if we look inside Russia, if we look at the, let's say, Russian people in this very broad sense, there still is a strong support of the imperial Russian concept or idea. Is it the legacy? Is it the poison of imperialism, or what is it? Or is it simply not being aware that of occupation as a crime?
I wouldn't define this exactly as a legacy of imperialism, because this would mean that people are like consciously in imperial mode of thinking. They're subconsciously there, mostly. It's more about... Russian society still, I think, is fixed on domination and redistribution of power. It's also the feature of the Russian culture, which I observe a lot. Who is in charge? Who is the main poet? Who is the biggest? Who actually holds power?
It's the vertical of power.
It's the vertical of power. And I would say that it's more about this complex of superiority, which offers reimbursement for any troubles of living in Russia. And recently I heard very good definition by Stefan Ingvarsson, who said, I mean, we can define the borders of Ruski Mir, where it comes and goes.
The Russian world.
As a territory where the value of the human life suddenly decreases.
Okay, this means, this is enlightening, because this sheds light on what you just said before, that the whole neighborhood is in danger. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that this sadly also goes for Ukraine, because I think it's still 30% of the Ukrainian territory occupied by Russia. And in these occupation zones, I think we can summarize very briefly, human life does not count anything, right?
Yeah, and it's not just, like occupation where another army enters, I don't know, but still the local police functions. It's just about who is in charge somewhere on the top. It is occupation. It's the same regime Soviets introduced, meaning the secret police is already there for years, meaning all the locals are inferior. They have to obey. And meaning that the whole political, cultural and national landscape is transformed in a very brutal way, which aims to make it the part of Russia. And it's not just the ordinary life, but under the other umbrella. It's not an ordinary life in any sense. And this, I would say, is the most important message for the broader audience in Europe, which can be only proven by sharing the experience of those who were under the Soviet occupation, who know exactly how it works, who know exactly what a pain, suffering, and injustice it causes, and how long it takes to deal with the consequences. Because, of course, it means also that the Russian settlers are brought in, that the Russian language is introduced, that the Russian monuments are built, and its full-scale dominance exercised by every channel possible. And then, when somehow Russia leaves, this infrastructure stays. And it can be reactivated, it can be referred to, and still stands as an infrastructure of dominance.
So this means if now, politically speaking, in these days, we have calls between US President Trump and Vladimir Putin, and we have Ukraine and European heads of state somehow involved in talks about armistice, if at all. This means the legacy of this war, independent of what kind of arrangement there will be, the legacy of this war will last for how many generations? What do you...
May I offer an imaginable example?
Yes, please.
Yeah, but really like a tough one. Because what we know, of course, that since 2014, the whole generation had grown up under the occupation. And these people were drafted to the Russian army. And they were sent to the front line to fight against their countrymen. Imagine yourself a war between Eastern and Western Germany. A war. Not a standstill, not a cold something. A war. And how and when.
And me being drafted, let's say.
Yeah, how and when then their reunification will come. We have an open wound. And we honestly, as intellectuals or historians, we do not know how to heal this. We do not know. We only right now can say that the worst possible experience of the 20th century is being reintroduced. And we were not able to deal with this back then. Because we had when the Soviet socialist camp collapsed, Russians went free. Nobody asked any tough questions. It was just taken for granted. It's good that the tanks are moving back east, the troops are moving east, and okay, let them go. No hard questions asked. And also Russians took this for granted. I mean, I've heard a lot of stories when I don't know Russians coming to Poland or Czech Republic, and suddenly they are surprised that some of the local people ask some questions. What are you talking about? We had withdrawn. This was a gift to you, bastards. And there was a very small space for dialogue. There was a very small space for understanding. But I would say that this understanding could start, at least potentially, again, repeating the thesis, with those who are now in Europe, with those who somehow are sharing the experiences of those who fled Lithuania or Poland, who were seeking asylum in Sweden or in France. It's at least a potential situation where you can compare and learn.
If those who are now in Europe, you mean intellectuals who have left Russia,
the whole spectrum of those who left Russia.
Yeah. Do you see any? That's an interesting one and I would like to dig a bit into that. Do you see any initiative into that direction already, or is there something in the air? Because, as a German citizen, observing the way my country went with, confronting or not confronting Russia and dealing with Russia and dealing with the commemoration of the Second World War, dealing with the monuments, the Soviet monuments. I mean, we went a long way, but we are not yet there. I think there's a lot to do. And you also said that Germany is stuck. So maybe we need kind of counterpart, we as citizens, but also maybe German politicians need a kind of counterpart to interact, to discuss these questions. Is there any kind of initiative? Whom could they call?
Me.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, we spoke about the end of the war in Europe.
Yes.
But there is also a day which commemorates, in a way, the beginning of the Second World War in Europe. And this is the day of August 23rd, when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed, effectively in starting the war. And this day, which clearly links Germany and Russia, or Russia and Germany, because there were two signatories to this paper. This day clearly states who did what. And this day is already introduced in the European Union as a day of remembrance of both victims of the Nazism and communism. But this day is in a sleepy mode.
That's true. It's not very much... there's not much awareness.
It's not much awareness. It's not much of energy. It exists in, I won't be tough, but I would say in a semi-bureaucratic way. Like, we did this, thank you. But potentially as a symbolical thing which really links Germany and Russia, but not in the end, but in the beginning. This is the place where you can start build bridges and start to initiate the reflection and rethinking of the whole story. And I would say that I only hope that some interface or some group or some organization, formal or informal, on the Russian side will emerge sooner or later. And then it would be possible to start a dialogue, not about what happened after 1945, not about who did what, this was a liberation, occupation, liberative occupation, or what. Things are clearer in 1939. And when you have this clearness, it's very tough. Clarity. But this is there. Maybe, this is the right departure point for the discussion. Well,
it could be a departure point for the discussion, which, at least from my point of view, should be a discussion that involves actors from different countries, not only Russia and Germany, obviously.
Not only Russia and Germany, and maybe not only European countries. I mean, I also Okay, I will be a little bit more radical here. We hear all this discussion. Should be Russian ambassador or Russian representative invited to Auschwitz? Meine Güte, there are other countries there, in Caucasus, in Asia, whose soldiers were there, who liberated Auschwitz as well as Russians. Why not to invite as a honorary guest or as a main speaker someone else? And it would be a good gesture. It would be a really good gesture. It's not like binary choice, Russia or no one.
Mm-hmm. So there is a variety of different actors who could play a role.
There are a variety of actors. And these countries, these nations are really in a very different positions towards the European Union. Moldova is on its way. I know Georgia was. But
Georgia was on its way.
It's blocked. And this opens a really quite a box or toolbox of possibilities if you stop thinking about Russia as a main stakeholder here.
This was our Geschichte ist Gegenwart History and Politics podcast with Sergei Lebedew on Russia's use of the Second World War history as a propaganda tool and on potential ways for Germany and Europe to deal with it. My question is, how do you feel after listening to this episode? Do you also think that a broader debate about the legacy of Soviet occupation in Europe would be a kick-off for a better way of understanding the roots and the aims behind Russia's war against Ukraine? Or would you agree that we need to diversify our perception of Russia as a historical and current perpetrator? Or do you have a completely different view on these issues? We look forward to your feedback, so you can email us at gp@Körber-Stiftung.de. If you are now interested to learn more about Sergei Lebedew's writings, we have included some information for you in our show notes. If you'd like to listen to other English language episodes of our History and Politics podcast, just scroll down in your podcatcher and you will easily find a couple of episodes in English, either as part of our special series, The New Germany, that deals with the implications of Zeitenwende for Germany, or some other relevant topics such as the role of Ukrainian historians during the ongoing Russian war against their country, and the historical background of current disinformation campaigns. Thank you so much for listening. If you like our monthly podcast, we'd be happy if you subscribe to it, but I hope you have done so already. We'd be happy if you'd recommend us to others, of course. If you are interested in the work that we are doing at our History and Politics department at Körber-Stiftung, please check out our website at Körber-Stiftung.de, and there you'll find our department listed separately. Stay tuned for our next episode coming in June, dealing with the current state crisis in Bosnia-Herzegovina and dealing with the question whether that finally ends the Dayton Agreement. For now, stay tuned, all the best, tschüss and goodbye from Hamburg.